Alrighty, friends, welcome back to our last video lesson for this particular week and for this module. So what we're going to focus on here are biogeochemical cycles. I keep it that way and use that term biogeochemical because we're using all of those different types of science to help us describe different cycles that are very important for various parts of our planet. Biology is used, chemistry is used, and geology is even used in this as well, because geology is part of it, rocks are part of it. So this is going to be probably one of the more important lessons, perhaps of this entire course, but certainly of this module. You are going to have a decent assignment for this particular idea. So be sure to pay attention to this video closely and reach out if you have any questions on anything, but really try to consider every aspect of these ideas and of these cycles, and then choose one that resonates with you. If you want to give yourself a challenge, maybe one that you don't necessarily understand as well, and then you can try to really parse it out and separate things and really try to gain a better understanding of the idea. So all that said, there are three main cycles that we are going to focus on for this class. We have the water cycle, which is probably a cycle that you've learned about ever since you were perhaps in elementary, middle, or high school. Then we have the carbon cycle, which you're probably a little bit lesser familiar with. And then the nitrogen cycle, which may have the least amount of knowledge on. Your book also goes into the phosphorus cycle, but we're not going to focus too heavily on that one. But it is still very interesting because, phosphorus is still a necessary nutrient that we need. So how we're gonna consider these ideas is through something called pool and process models. So you can think of a pool like a reservoir as another common term to think about. And that's where the material hangs out, right? And when we're looking at these diagrams, they're usually depicted as labels in boxes in pool and process models. Whereas a process is where you bring that material from one pool into another pool. And these are then depicted as arrows. So you're going from one pool into another pool. So I want you to consider simple examples in your everyday life. And then you're going to think on a much larger global scale. So your assignment this week is to physically draw these ideas, a pool and process model. And then you can use the following slides, your textbook, or any other outside materials that you can access to help guide you with this assignment. So when you consider like simple examples in your everyday life, like let's think of something like your bathtub, right? Your bathtub itself is a reservoir, right? It's a pool. And you have, if you turn the faucet on, you have water coming in and you have water going out, right? And sometimes, as long as you have the same amount of water coming in at the same rate as the same amount of water going out, as long as the same rate, then your pool, your reservoir in your bathtub will not collect water, right? But say, maybe you have long hair like me. I know it's up in a bun today, but if you have long hair like me, then, the drain can get kind of clogged pretty quickly, pretty easily. So if you have something not allowing for water to flow down the drain and out of that reservoir, then you're going to have a buildup of water there, right? So that's just kind of an example of something simple in your everyday life that you can then apply a bigger idea to this. So we're going to start here with the hydraulic cycle or the water cycle here. So I want you to take some time to study this graphic. It's in your book, but obviously it's also on these slides and in this video. So notice how the processes are very well labeled with these arrows, right? The biggest pool of water on our planet is the oceans. But notice that the ocean is not labeled here. It's just some indiscrete type of water. We're just inferring that it is the ocean. But we have different processes here, right? You have, evaporation. You're going from this water source to the atmosphere pool, but it doesn't automatically go into the condensation pool. There's a different process that happens there, right? And then with condensation, you can then precipitate, and you can precipitate that in either the liquid phase of water or the solid phase of water. Think about that, right? Different types of precipitation that we get around our planet. But in processes that maybe we don't think about too often, or often enough, I should say, in terms of the water cycle, are evaporation and transpiration from grasslands and trees and plant life, which we combine those two terms to call evapotranspiration. Excuse me. But also when we precipitate, that can go into rivers, which can maybe flow back into the ocean system, or it can infiltrate into the ground and then be considered groundwater, which then maybe will make its way back into the ocean system or the ocean reservoir. Here's just another graphic. This is actually from my oceanography textbook, but this has a little bit better of an idea in terms of kind of rates in a way. That's what these numbers are supposed to mean, like how much are you evaporating more or are you precipitating more? But it does somewhat nicely show the ocean part here. But the other pools of water on our planet are not distinctly labeled, right? I would love for you to maybe pause this video or consider, going back a slide or something, and you should be able to pick out at least 6 to 8 pools and processes. 6 to 8 pools and 6 to 8 processes, right? So you should be able to consider what those are and be able to make boxes and label them. I also want you to consider unique characteristics for this particular cycle. What makes water go through this process of evaporation? What makes it condensate? What makes it run off? What is the physical process of this? So I want you to consider that. I also want you to consider human impacts within the different pools and processes, right? And I want you to think of think of just quantity, not quality. So we're not thinking about how fresh or good is this water. Can we actually use it as humans to drink, things like that? But I want you to think about the quantity within each pool. And I encourage you to write down your ideas, try to take some time and draw your first pool and process diagram. This will be extraordinarily helpful for the assignment for this week. Use your time as you so choose. Can lead a horse to water, can't make him drink it. Oh, puns. Next up, we're moving on to the carbon cycle for our planet, and perhaps you're less familiar with this cycle. And keep in mind that this is also not a pool and process diagram. So basically, I don't want you to copy and paste this diagram or copy and draw this diagram. You're going to have to add a little bit more context into this, but it gives you a nice start to this idea, right? So through the process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is taken from the atmosphere pool and brought into our lovely plants, in this case trees, which then carbon then goes into the soil and then is decomposed here, right? Which is really interesting, which then kind of stores that carbon then into the rock process, or the rocks, or the lithosphere, as we also call it. But trees and producers also do cellular respiration, right? So that can add oxygen to the system. But we can't forget about consumers, which then eat other organisms and take up their carbon, right? Even if you are on the carnivore diet or whatever, you're still eating plants in a roundabout way. Because whatever your carnivore ate, or whatever your meat ate, was probably a plant, which is some sort of carbon, which then you are then ingesting. Kind of interesting, right? So again, this is also good for a terrestrial biome, right? This is just on land, but it doesn't consider the oceans as well. Big difference between the ocean is there's way, way, way less of this idea of decomposition and decomposers. So there's actually a huge pool of carbon in this ocean sediments. The ocean is actually our largest carbon sink, to its detriment at this point, actually, because of the rise of CO2 in our atmosphere. More carbon is then being basically dissolved into the ocean surface, which is causing something called ocean acidification, which is actually really, really sad. Also, this diagram does not consider fossil fuels, right? So that's something to also keep in mind. Different diagrams in your book, or like the subsequent diagrams along this one in your book, talk or consider the idea of fossil fuels and things like deforestation and forest fires. Also, again, I want you to consider the unique characteristics of this cycle and how humans can also impact this cycle. Next up, we have nitrogen. So this may be the cycle that you were least familiar with. I certainly know that I was least familiar with this cycle. But what's really wild is that every single cell in your body uses nitrogen, and the atmosphere is nearly entirely nitrogen, right? But we don't incorporate nitrogen into our bodies like we do, say, oxygen and carbon, right? Which is really, really fascinating to think about. And this entire cycle is pretty much entirely run by bacteria. Bacteria is everywhere. It was probably one of the most, like, in a sense, primitive aspects of life, called prokaryotes, right? So you have all of these things being broken down. Things die, things poop, things pee, and get into the soils, get into the land, and then things can get broken down. Even in your body, in your tummy, in your mouth, right? You have different bacteria that helps you break down the food in your mouth, and then as it goes down into your tummy, it helps break it down further before, it goes out of you in some way, shape, form, or another. So it's really quite fascinating, I think, and fungus is a big thing here as well. Love me some mushrooms. Which I didn't used to like mushrooms, by the way. So if you're someone you're like, mushrooms, that's gross. Listen, your taste buds might change. So again, I want you to consider unique characteristics of this cycle and how humans can impact it. This is a different diagram from a different textbook, but I think this one will be more useful when you're considering the pools and processes model, right? So consider the primary pools and processes and how they're all related. Are there any unique and interesting characteristics? And then how do humans influence this cycle? So certainly take some time to study this idea, and especially if you're least familiar with it. Lastly, I'm just going to quickly touch on the phosphorus cycle of our planet. So our assignment for this week is not going to include this cycle, but it's still interesting to consider. Big thing here is that there's no pool of the atmosphere. All of the other three cycles included a pool of the atmosphere, but this one does not, which infers and suggests that this pool tends to stay more localized, whereas the other three are more global, right? Because in the atmosphere, things move around. We treat the atmosphere as a fluid, or in the oceans, right? Things are very mobile, whereas with phosphorus, not so much. It's pretty much just hanging out in our rocks. So that's biogeochemical cycles that we're going to focus on in this particular module. So if you may need to watch this video several times, and that's just the nature of the beast. So use your book, use this video, reach out to me if you have any questions, come to office hours, anything along those lines, and I'm happy to assist in any way that I can. Thank you again so much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day.